I remember a few years ago, I was on a train journey travelling across central Scotland, and as I was walking down the central aisle to get to my seat, I saw this young kid, and they were, quite frankly, just glued to the window. They were transfixed by what they were seeing. They were mesmerised by the countryside as it flew past. They were just so immersed in the experience of being in the moment. And I remember thinking, how cool would it be if you were to step into those shoes just long enough to experience that sense of deep fascination with the world, that level of immersion? And from there, what would it be like if you were to capture some of that feeling and just allow it to be there more often in life? And it's funny because I think this is what many of us as adults want more of in our life. I think we all have some vague memory of what it felt like to be a kid, where we had a natural feeling of bliss and euphoria. But then, unfortunately, as adults, things do start to get a little bit serious, don't they? Life gets serious. And due to a variety of different reasons, we start to lose the connection with that blissful, immersed state of mind. We get caught up in all manner of nonsense that takes us further and further away from this natural way of being. And we can often drift so far away from it that we think it's disappeared completely. But the truth is, it doesn't go away completely. It just kind of hides. It fades off into the background. But we all still retain the ability to return to that childlike, blissful place. And one of the ways to recapture a bit of that is through a mindfulness practice called the beginner's mind. So in this episode of the podcast, we're going to take a look at this incredible principle and how it can lead to more bliss, enjoyment, and ease in your life. Hey there and welcome to the Stress Less Living podcast. My name is Stephen Burns and I've been a practicing coach, trainer and hypnotherapist for 25 years. Each week I'll share easily digestible bite-sized ideas that you can immediately put into practice so that you can live a more harmonious and balanced life. Because life is challenging, but whatever we encounter, we always have a choice. We can take the easy routes or the hard routes, the low stress way or the high stress way. Well, the Stress Less Living podcast is about always looking for the easy routes in life, the low stress ways to accomplish your goals, get more of what you want, and ultimately live a happy and more effortless life. So if you're looking for the perfect antidote for the chaos of modern life, my friend, you are absolutely in the right place. So in this episode, we're going to talk mindfulness. So mindfulness is something that has become super popular over the last 10 to 15 years, but it isn't really a new thing. The principles have been around for a long time. So mindfulness is kind of like a rebranding of selected Zen Buddhist principles. They've been cleaned up a bit. A lot of the metaphors about mountains and Zen masters talking in riddles have been stripped away, and it's then been repackaged in a way that fits more with the Western mind. And one principle that can be utterly life-changing is something called the beginner's mind. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this episode. So what is the beginner's mind? Well, it's about dropping all expectations and ideas that you have about something. It's about looking on with fresh eyes, seeing experience as a blank canvas. There's a great quote I heard a number of years ago from the co-creator of NLP, that's Neuro-Linguistic Programming, Dr. Richard Bandler. And he said that disappointment requires adequate planning. And it's a great quote, isn't it? Because I think there's a lot of truth in that in order to be disappointed, we have to create an expectation inside our mind of how we want something to work out, and then compare it to how we think it has worked out, and then feel bad about it. And that feeling of bad is often what we label as disappointment. That there's a thought process involved, and we have to be invested in that thought process to feel bad. But what happens if we just do a quick experiment here? What happens if you drop those expectations? Just let go of that thought process for a moment. Where does your attention go? Well, it naturally returns to the moment, and your attention shifts to actual experience rather than being caught up in your head thinking how things are going to work out and how they should have worked out and all of that stuff. And this, for me, is the essence of the beginner's mind. It's about letting go of expectations. Temporarily, it's about appreciating the fallibility of our thought processes so that we can naturally return to the moment and just enjoy the flux and flow of experience. Because when we're in experience, rather than intensely thinking about it, that's where so much of the natural bliss and joy of life exists. You know, I remember quite a few years ago when I still worked in the oil and gas industry. So it was actually right at the very beginning of that career path. So I think I was only 17 or 18 at the time. And as apprentices, they sent us on a thing called an Outward Bounds course. So basically what happens is you go up to the north of Scotland and it's kind of like a team building thing. And they get you to do all kinds of, crazy stuff like jump into the lochs first thing in the morning when it's like freezing cold in the middle of November, and climb trees and various different other things. And one of the activities that we did was something called a trapeze jump. So what that is basically you get all harnessed in, and then you have to climb up this really big, tall, thin pole. And then you get to the very top and you stand on this small platform. And then when you're on the platform, you have to then jump off and grab onto this trapeze that's a few feet away. So there was a couple of things that were going on for me that was making me so incredibly nervous. So the first thing was I was actually quite afraid of heights. Now, it wasn't a full-blown phobia, but it was strong enough to make me tremble and feel mildly terrified at climbing up this pole. And the second thing was, because all of my friends, my co-workers had already done it, I potentially could be the first one to fail. And that was a real big deal for me at the time. Not so much now, but it was a huge big deal back then. So I'd placed this massive expectation on myself that I had to succeed or I was going to be a total failure. So I got to the top and I was really struggling. And to be honest, the only thing that was getting me through it was I didn't want to be the first person to fail. And eventually I got to the top of this pole and I stood on the little small cylindrical platform. And then I took a couple of deep breaths, my knees were trembling, and I jumped off, and you maybe guessed it, but I missed the trapeze and I ended up just floating in midair. The harness kicked in. But the thing is, as I was dangling in midair, my friends were kind of looking up, wondering what the heck was going on. I got a bit of a revelation, or I think a realization would be a better way to describe it. All of a sudden, I realized that I was completely safe. All of the fear that I had about heights kind of just disappeared in that moment. So then the instructor said to me, "Do you want a second go?" And I said, "Yeah, let's do this. I don't want to end on failure with this." So I did it again, and it was really, really strange because all the fear just disappeared. The expectation I had about having to be a success in it, all the fear I had about heights, it hadn't just reduced, it had totally disappeared. There was nothing there at all. And I actually really enjoyed the experience. I could fully connect with it. And I thought, wow, that's really strange. It was like a mini moment of enlightenment. And for me, I always like a rational explanation to something. And my logical, rational explanation is that I had an experience that exposed the illusionary nature of my thinking, my expectations. That expectation I had inside my mind that heights were this monumentally scary and dangerous experience were exposed as being fake. I was harnessed in. I was completely safe. And I'm sure you've heard of the saying that fear is the acronym for false evidence appearing real. And that was the realization I got. And also the expectation I had about failing in front of my friends. They were exposed to be fakes as well, because they didn't seem to care. They had their own stuff going on. And I think this is often the case, isn't it? We worry so much about what other people think, but the reality is that they don't really give a damn. They've got their own stuff to deal with. So having these expectations exposed as illusions brought me back into the moment, and I just simply enjoyed the experience. And that's what we're talking about here. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the beginner's mind. So it's often talked about as something that you want to adopt whenever you're learning a new subject. So the opposite of the beginner's mind is what's referred to as the expert mind. And this is where you believe that you know a lot about the topic and you have strong opinions about it. So you end up bringing all of those preconceived beliefs and ideas into the learning experience, and it contaminates it. So you miss all of the new information because you believe that you know best. So there was a really funny example of this on a comedy radio show a number of years ago in Los Angeles. So the show featured a parody of a psychoanalyst. And this particular psychoanalyst vehemently believed that having fish in your dreams was the root of all psychological problems. So as part of the show, someone phoned him up and pretended to be a client and tell him about a problem they were experiencing. And as they were telling this psychoanalyst about it, he just interrupted them straight away and said, "Excuse me, you didn't happen to have a dream last night, did you?" And they replied, "Yeah, I guess I did." And he said, "Well, did you dream about fish by any chance?" And they said, "No." So he said, "Okay, so what was in your dream specifically then?" And they started to describe this scene. They said, "Well, I was walking down a street and all of a sudden the therapist interrupted them again and said, so could there have been a restaurant nearby?" And they said, "Yeah." And he said, "And could that restaurant have sold fish?" And they said, "Yeah, I'm sure it would have done." So he said, "There you go, fish and dreams, the root of all your problems." And this is a parody, of course, it's a comedy show, but it was apparently quite common in traditional Freudian psychotherapy, especially in the 70s and 80s, that the therapist would be so certain that the client was abused as a child because they believed that all problems came from childhood trauma, that they actually installed that in their clients. And actually, many of them started to believe that they were traumatized, even though they hadn't been, that the therapist had inadvertently managed to implant false memories of trauma. They'd done it by accident. So even though this is a comedy show I just talked about, I think it's a great example of the expert mind and the pitfall of subscribing too heavily to thinking that you know best. If you believe strongly that you know something, then you're going to miss out on all new, fresh information. So whenever you're learning a subject, you want to temporarily drop your preconceived ideas, just park them, place them to the side for a moment, and then go in with fresh eyes. Like you're a kid learning a subject for the very first time, just like that kid on the train that I talked about earlier on. There's actually a famous example, just to give you another one, of this in the field of optics. So in the 50s, they believed that the field of optics was the only closed field. So what that means is that they knew everything there was to know about optics and there was nothing new to discover. And this actually became a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and the field started to stagnate. And then someone came along and looked at things with a fresh mind. They were a bit of a nonconformist, and hey presto, they invented lasers. The whole field was blown wide open. And this is the thing, isn't it? When we think we know something, we usually don't. The reality is, everything is a process, and we continually discover new things each day. And the way to discover these new things is to embrace the beginner's mind. So, you're a busy person, you have a demanding job or a hectic lifestyle, and you've heard that meditation is a great way to reduce stress and create calm within the chaos that is your life. But you've tried meditation a few times, maybe with an app or from a book or a YouTube video, and it's just not really worked for you, and you've maybe jumped to the conclusion that meditation isn't for you. Well, if that's the case, I just want to say that it's most likely not your fault. A lot of the time when meditation doesn't really work that well, it's because you're missing a couple of key steps. And if you want to learn what those key steps are and some of the fundamentals of meditation, then I have a free video training that you can enrol on. If you want to check that out, I've included a link to it in the show notes and all the information that you need. So like I said, the beginner's mind is often talked about in relation to learning a subject, but it does go way beyond that. It's a way of approaching experience that allows us to slip into the moment and connect with all of that default joy and pleasure that life naturally has to offer. That whenever we have any kind of experience in life, there are two ways to approach it. The first way is we have the raw, actual experience, where we just let go into it and just simply let it happen. The second way is where we think about the experience, where we step out and actually think about what's going on. We start to analyse, assess, and interpret what just happened and what it means. And so often people max out on this second one, when really we should be spending most of our time in the first. Now, in truth, we float between the two, don't we? It's not an either-or choice between experiencing and thinking, and there is a time for analysing and assessing information. It's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater here, but for many people, the needle has definitely moved too far over to the side of thinking and analysing and wondering what something means. I remember a friend of mine was at a Radiohead concert in Glasgow a number of years ago, and he posted on Facebook a photograph of him at the concert. It was a selfie, of course, and the caption was, "Having a great time at the Radiohead concert." And I remember thinking, are you having a great time at the concert, or are you having a great time on your phone thinking about how many likes you're going to get from this post? And that might sound a little bit harsh, but I think there's a lot of truth to this. There's a big difference between thinking about an experience, assessing, analysing, planning and wondering, and actually having that experience. The first is a lot of work. And when we do it excessively, it takes us away from the moment, the natural joy and beauty of life. But the second is much simpler. It's much more basic and primal. It's where we just let go into the experience and allow things to unfold and flow. And the thing is, when you get used to it, you start to realise that it is actually a lot less work than overthinking things all the time inside your head. There's a simplicity to life that we often forget. You know, life can sometimes seem so complicated, but it is often a complexity of our own making because of how we think about it. But when we just let go and simply connect with the experiences in our life, that simplicity starts to shine through. And this is what happens when you adopt the beginner's mind. Not just when you're learning a skill or a new subject, but whenever you're having any kind of experience. When you approach it with fresh eyes, you connect with your experiences and the simplicity and beauty of life, that natural bliss starts to open up. Don't overinvest in your ability to think. And I know that sounds a bit of a strange thing. I'm not saying you shouldn't critique things. You shouldn't engage in critical thinking. Of course you should do that. But it's about appreciating that that's only one way of, approaching life. And don't forget about pure raw experience. And the thing is, even if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, if we get a little bit scientific here, the more cognitive aspects of our mind have evolved to act as an assistant. They're there to help us assess and analyse our environment. It makes it possible for us to plan and avoid danger and create better opportunities in our life. But it's not meant to be the entire landscape of our experience. The rest of the landscape is where we just let go and connect with experience, where we're just going with the flux and flow of the moments. And we start to activate that way of experiencing naturally by cultivating the beginner's mind. So, of course, that leads us on to the key question, and that is, how do you cultivate the beginner's mind? So there's a lot to this, but I want to give you a couple of tips. So tip number one, you want to remember what it's like to be a kid again. The famous self-help mega guru Tony Robbins frequently says that we have to awaken the giant within. It's also the title of his best-selling book. And that's fine. I'm sure we all have giants in there, and it's a great title for a book, that's for sure. But I think it's much more powerful to awaken the child within, because when we're kids, we haven't yet developed the cognitive aspects of our mind. It's not until we start hitting our teenage years that those parts of the brain begin to develop. So as a kid, we don't analyse stuff. We don't overthink because we can't. We're left alone to exist in a place of discovery and exploration. Our default setting is something akin to the beginner's mind, and we're fully connected with experience so much more often. So even though things are different as an adult, we don't have a time machine and we can't go back to when we were 6 years old, we can rekindle that in our imagination. We can relight that fire. The more that we imagine what it was like when we were kids and attempt to approach life from that more innocent mindset, the more we naturally experience the beginner's mind. So what would it be like if you were to approach the experiences of your life through the eyes of a kid? That sense of wonderment, just like that kid that was glued to the window on the train right at the very start of this episode with that raw fascination, that sense of immersion of being transfixed with the world. What would that be like if you were to step into those shoes? So that's tip number one. And tip number two is more of a question that I'd like you to consider. And the question is this: when are you most connected with experience? Weird question, so let me explain. So what aspects of life capture your attention the most? Maybe it's an activity that you do or certain people that you're with. But what is it that captures your attention so much that you become locked into that experience? So for me, there's several, but one of the things that comes to mind is when I'm practicing golf on a nice sunny day. Not when I'm playing in a competition, that's a different type of immersion, a bit more stress involved in that. But I'm just practicing, I'm just playing about with things, and I just feel connected in the moment. You know, I can hear the birds chirping, there's trees around about me, I can hear the background noise. I'm fully in my body and everything is just calm and peaceful. And that's usually a telltale sign that you've got something good here, is if you have an experience where you just feel fully in your body and not in your head, then that's a great way to start activating and cultivating this beginner's mindset, where you're in the moment and every experience is something fresh. I also get it now and again when I'm dancing, not always, because partner work dancing can be quite complex and you sometimes have to think about what you're doing and you're planning moves and all of that stuff. But when I dance with a follower who is at a high level and we connect, then I don't have to think about the dance anymore. It just flows. I feel connected with the music and the whole experience is just fantastic. It's amazing. So you want to explore that question. When are you most connected with experience? And the reason why this is such a great question to explore is because when you're fully connected with an experience like this, the beginner's mind is activated. You're not assessing what's going on, what's about to happen. There's no expectations. You're approaching it with openness and a completely fresh mind, as if it's the first time that you've ever had this experience. And when you do this, the beginner's mind gets naturally activated and you begin to connect with all of that default bliss and joy that this special state of mind has to offer. So 2 tips. Tip number 1, remember what it was like to be a kid. And number 2, explore the question, when are you most connected with experience? When are you in your body and not trapped in your mind thinking about stuff? So that is the beginner's mind, or really just an introduction to it. There's a lot more I can say on this subject, but ultimately it's about approaching life through fresh eyes. It's good to become an expert in something, of course, but to adopt the expert's mindset all the time is going to blind you to new information. It's going to prevent you from connecting fully with experience. So instead, it's about approaching your experiences through the eyes of a fascinated kid. It's about being curious, fascinated, inquisitive and experimental. It's about connecting with experience and just allowing it to naturally flow without forcing expectations or opinions onto it. And when we do that, we just naturally slip into the moment. And when we naturally slip into the moment, we get to experience so much of the natural beauty, joy, and bliss that life has to offer. And it's also about realizing that the world of thought, where we analyze, assess, and interpret, is just there as a guide, as an assistant. It's not the full landscape of our experience as a human being. And more often than not, how we think about a situation is wildly different to the actual experience anyway, so we shouldn't be over-investing in these thoughts or ideas. That when we expose the fallibility of our thinking, it gives us much more license to meet the world at the level of experience more often than at the level of thinking. So as I'm sure you know by now, I tend to like to finish episodes with a quote. And I got this quote from Facebook, of all places. So a friend of mine posted this, a guy called Stephen Woolston, who's a coach, just to give him credit. So the quote is this: when today's breakthrough insight becomes the new rule, it becomes tomorrow's new way of getting stuck. And I love this quote, and I think it illustrates quite beautifully the importance of the beginner's mind state. So thank you so much for tuning in and listening. Let me know what you think about this style of content. There will be more stuff on mindfulness. I think it's a really important way to approach life. And if you enjoyed this and got value out of it, then I would love it if you could follow or subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts and consider leaving a review. So thank you once again, and I'll speak to you in the next episode.